They came in the early morning before the heat turned the valley into an oven. 12 men on motorbikes, wearing sandals and shalwar kameez, carrying rifles that were older than their grandfathers. No radios, no satellite phones, no chain of command stretching back to a Pentagon war room. Just local knowledge, tribal loyalty, and the patience of people who had been fighting foreign invaders for centuries. By noon, a convoy of American armored vehicles lay burning on a mountain road. 3 soldiers dead, 2 wounded, millions of dollars in equipment destroyed. And the men on motorbikes were gone, melted back into villages where no satellite could find them, no informant would betray them, and no drone strike could reach them without killing the civilians whose protection was their greatest weapon. This was not Kabul. This was not Baghdad. This was Yemen, 2016. But it could have been Saigon, 1968. It could have been Kandahar, 2009. It could have been any of 1,000 places where the most powerful military in the history of the world met an enemy it could not see, could not understand, and could not defeat. The pattern is ancient. The outcome is inevitable. And the superpowers keep repeating it, convinced that this time will be different, that technology will overcome terrain, that money will buy loyalty, that firepower will break will. They are always wrong. To understand why great powers lose small wars, you have to forget everything Hollywood taught you about warfare. You have to abandon the image of decisive battles, of flag raising on captured hills, of surrender ceremonies on battleships. Small wars do not end with victory parades. They end with exhausted withdrawals, with negotiated exits that everyone knows are disguised defeats, with helicopters lifting the last diplomats from embassy rooftops while the enemy watches from the gates. They end with veterans who cannot explain what they fought for, with populations who cannot understand why their sons and daughters died in places they could not find on a map, with empires that spent their blood and treasure on conflicts that weakened them without strengthening anything. The small war is not an aberration in the history of great powers. It is the graveyard of empires, and the graveyard is filling up faster than ever. The mathematics of the small war are brutally simple and consistently ignored. A superpower projects force across oceans and continents, spending billions to move soldiers, equipment, and supplies to a distant land. The guerrilla lives in that land, knows every trail, every cave, every family that will hide him, every elder who will lie to the foreign patrol. The superpower fights on a clock, measured in election cycles, budget approvals, and public opinion polls that turn against prolonged conflict with predictable regularity. The guerrilla fights on a calendar measured in generations, in the memory of grandfathers who resisted the last invader, in the promise that his children will continue the struggle after he is gone. The superpower must win everywhere, every day, because any single defeat is a propaganda victory for the enemy. The guerrilla must win nowhere, only survive, because his mere existence proves that the superpower cannot control the territory it claims to own. The superpower soldiers rotate home after 6 months or a year, carrying psychological wounds that the VA will struggle to treat for decades. The guerrilla soldiers never rotate. They are home. Their families are the front line. Their villages are the battlefield. And they will still be there when the last foreign boot has left their soil. Vietnam was the textbook case, the war that should have taught every subsequent generation of American policymakers the futility of fighting an enemy that does not fight by your rules. The United States dropped more bombs on Vietnam than all sides dropped in World War II. It deployed over 500,000 troops at the peak of the conflict. It spent, in today's dollars, over $1 trillion on a country smaller than New Mexico. And it lost to an army that marched in sandals, that carried supplies on bicycles, that had no air force, no navy, and no industrial base. The Tet Offensive of 1968 was a military disaster for the Viet Cong. They suffered catastrophic casualties. They failed to hold a single city they attacked. And yet they won the war that day because they proved that the Americans could not secure the country they had occupied for 3 years, that the enemy could strike anywhere at any time, that the superpower's narrative of progress was a lie. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, looked into a camera after Tet and told the nation that the war was unwinnable. Lyndon Johnson, hearing those words, reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." He was right. He did not run for re-election. The war continued for 7 more years, but the outcome was sealed. The guerrilla had won not by defeating the American military, but by defeating the American will to continue. The pattern repeated in Afghanistan with a precision that should have been humiliating. The Soviet Union, another superpower convinced of its ideological and military superiority, invaded Afghanistan in 1979. It deployed over 100,000 troops. It installed a puppet government. It bombed villages, mined fields, and killed an estimated 1 million Afghans. And it lost to men armed with rifles and rocket-propelled grenades, funded by American and Saudi money, trained in Pakistani camps, and driven by a religious fervor that no amount of Soviet propaganda could match. The Afghan guerrillas, the Mujahideen, did not need to win battles. They needed to exist, to harass, to bleed the occupier slowly until the cost of staying exceeded the cost of leaving. The Soviet Union, already rotting from within, could not afford the war economically or politically. It withdrew in 1989. 2 years later, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. The Afghan war was not the sole cause of that collapse, but it was a contributing wound in a body already weakened by imperial overreach, economic stagnation, and ideological bankruptcy. And the lesson, if there was one, was not learned by the next superpower that came to Afghanistan. The American invasion of 2001 was born of legitimate rage. The Taliban had harbored Osama bin Laden. The attacks of September 11 demanded a response, but the response quickly transformed from a targeted counterterrorism mission into a nation-building fantasy. The idea that Afghanistan could be transformed into a democracy, that girls could go to school, that human rights could be imposed by force, that a country with no history of centralized governance could become a modern state because Americans wished it so. The Taliban, defeated and scattered in the initial invasion, regrouped in Pakistan. They returned not as an army but as a shadow, attacking convoys, assassinating officials, intimidating villagers, and waiting. They did not need to defeat the Americans in battle. They needed to outlast them. And they knew, with the certainty of men who had outlasted the British in the 19th century and the Soviets in the 20th, that the Americans would leave. Every election cycle brought a new president promising to end the war. Every budget debate brought new questions about the cost. Every casualty report brought new pain to American families who could not understand why their children were dying in a place that seemed to change nothing. The Taliban waited. They fought when they could. They hid when they must. They accepted casualties that would have broken a Western army because they believed their cause was sacred and their victory was inevitable. And in August 2021, they were proven right. The American withdrawal was a catastrophe of planning and execution, but its underlying cause was the same as in Vietnam and Soviet Afghanistan. The guerrilla had won the long game. The superpower had lost the will to play. Yemen added a new dimension to the pattern, one that should terrify any military planner who believes technology can overcome resolve. The Saudi-led coalition, armed with American weapons, American intelligence, and American diplomatic cover, intervened in Yemen's civil war in 2015. They had F-15 fighter jets, Apache attack helicopters, precision-guided munitions, and a budget that dwarfed anything the Houthi rebels could imagine. The Houthis had Iranian-supplied missiles, small arms, and a terrain advantage that turned Yemen's mountains into a fortress. The Saudis bombed wedding parties, funeral processions, hospitals, and schools. They blockaded ports, creating one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. They spent an estimated $100 billion on a war that achieved nothing. The Houthis, meanwhile, learned to build drones in workshops, to modify missiles with consumer electronics, to strike Saudi oil facilities hundreds of kilometers away with weapons that cost a fraction of the defenses arrayed against them. They did not need to defeat the Saudi military. They needed to make the war costly, embarrassing, and endless, and they succeeded. By 2024, Saudi Arabia was seeking a negotiated exit, willing to accept a Houthi-dominated Yemen rather than continue a conflict that was draining its treasury, damaging its reputation, and achieving none of its strategic objectives. The small war had defeated the wealthy war. The guerrilla with a workshop had humbled the kingdom with a defense budget larger than Russia's. The common thread in all these defeats is not military incompetence, though incompetence played a role. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of what war is when the enemy does not wear a uniform, does not control territory in the conventional sense, and does not seek victory in the way that Western military doctrine defines it. The guerrilla does not want to capture your capital. He wants to make your presence in his land unbearable. He does not want to destroy your army in a decisive battle. He wants to bleed it slowly, one ambush at a time, one roadside bomb at a time, one roadside bomb at a time, one kidnapped soldier at a time, until the cumulative cost exceeds the political will to continue. He does not need to be stronger than you. He needs to be more patient, more adaptable, and more willing to accept suffering. And in every small war in history, the guerrilla has possessed these qualities in abundance, while the superpower has exhausted them within a few years. The technological gap, which superpowers assume will guarantee victory, often becomes a liability. American forces in Vietnam had helicopters that could insert troops anywhere, but the helicopters needed fuel, maintenance, and pilots, creating supply lines that the Viet Cong could attack. In Afghanistan, drones provided surveillance that would have been unimaginable a generation earlier, but the drone footage required analysts, the analysts required secure bases, and the bases required convoys that were vulnerable to roadside bombs. In Yemen, the Saudi coalition's advanced aircraft required runways, and the runways required defenses, and the defenses required troops who became targets. Every technological advantage creates a logistical dependency. Every dependency creates a vulnerability, and the guerrilla, who needs nothing but a rifle, a motorbike, and a village that will feed him, has no such vulnerabilities. He is light where the superpower is heavy. He is mobile where the superpower is fixed. He is sustainable where the superpower is bleeding cash, at a rate that no treasury can endure indefinitely. The political dimension is even more decisive. A guerrilla army fights for its home, its family, its faith, its tribe. These are motivators that do not weaken over time. They strengthen with every foreign bomb that falls on a village, with every checkpoint that humiliates an elder, with every night raid that terrifies children. The superpower soldiers fight for a paycheck, for a rotation date, for a country they left behind and dream of returning to. They fight for abstract concepts like democracy and human rights that mean nothing to a farmer whose son was killed by a drone strike. The guerrilla's cause is immediate, personal, and visceral. The superpower's cause is distant, theoretical, and increasingly incomprehensible to the people who are asked to die for it. This asymmetry of motivation is the true battlefield of the small war, and it is a battlefield where technology, money, and firepower count for nothing. The home front is where small wars are truly lost. Every democracy that fights a small war eventually faces the question that destroys it. Why are we still there? The guerrilla does not face this question. His family is in the war zone. His home is the front line. He does not have the option of withdrawal because withdrawal means surrender, and surrender means death or subjugation. The superpower's public, watching the war on television, reading casualty reports, paying taxes that fund an endless conflict, eventually demands an answer that no government can provide. What are we fighting for? When will it end? What does victory look like? In Vietnam, the answer was peace with honor, a phrase that meant nothing and fooled no one. In Afghanistan, it was conditions-based withdrawal, which meant we will leave when the conditions are right, and the conditions were never right, and the conditions were never right. In Yemen, the Saudis could not even articulate a coherent war aim beyond restoring a government that had already proven it could not govern. The absence of a clear, achievable objective is the hallmark of the small war, and it is the poison that seeps into public support until the political cost of continuing exceeds the political cost of admitting defeat. The economic hemorrhage completes the trap. Small wars are not cheap. They are catastrophically expensive, not in the dramatic way of world wars, with their massive mobilizations and industrial conversions, but in the insidious way of 1,000 small cuts that bleed a treasury dry over years and decades. The Vietnam War cost the United States over $1 trillion in today's dollars. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan cost over $2 trillion each, with additional trillions in veteran care that will continue for generations. The Saudi war in Yemen, while smaller in absolute terms, consumed a significant portion of a national budget that was already strained by low oil prices and ambitious domestic projects. These are resources that could have been spent on infrastructure, education, healthcare, or economic development. They are resources that, once spent on war, produce no return except debt, trauma, and the bitter knowledge that they achieve nothing. The guerrilla's war is cheap. His weapons are captured or supplied by foreign patrons. His logistics are the villages that feed him. His payroll is the cause itself. The superpower's war is a money pit, and every dollar spent is a dollar that cannot be spent on the domestic priorities that keep a society healthy and a government popular. The intelligence failure is structural and recurring. Superpowers enter small wars believing they understand the enemy, the terrain, in the political dynamics. They are always wrong. In Vietnam, American policymakers believed they were fighting communist aggression directed from Moscow and Beijing. They did not understand that the Viet Cong were primarily nationalists, that their loyalty was to Vietnam first and communism second, and that the more the Americans framed the war as an ideological struggle, the more they drove neutral Vietnamese into the communist camp. In Afghanistan, the Americans believed they were fighting the Taliban as a terrorist organization. They did not understand that the Taliban were a social and political movement deeply embedded in Pashtun tribal structures, that their support came not from ideology alone, but from the protection they offered against warlords and foreign occupiers, and that every village they bombed created 10 new Taliban recruits. In Yemen, the Saudis believed they were fighting Iranian proxies. They did not understand that the Houthis were a domestic Yemeni movement with deep historical grievances, that Iranian support was opportunistic rather than decisive, and that their intervention was transforming a civil war into a national resistance. The superpower sees the small war through the lens of its own strategic concerns: communism, terrorism, Iranian expansion. The guerrilla sees it through the lens of his own existence: home, family, survival. The superpower's lens is distorted by distance, ideology, and institutional bias. The guerrilla's lens is clear because it is pressed against his own eye. The proxy dimension adds another layer of complexity that superpowers consistently underestimate. Small wars are rarely purely local. They are nodes in larger networks of great power competition, with external actors supplying weapons, funding, training, and diplomatic cover to their chosen sides. The Viet Cong received support from China and the Soviet Union. The Afghan Mujahideen received support from the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. The Houthis received support from Iran. This external support does not create the guerrilla movement, but it sustains it, arms it, and prevents the superpower from achieving the quick victory that would make the war politically sustainable. The superpower, fighting a proxy war through local allies, discovers that those allies have their own agendas, their own corruption, their own brutality that alienates the population the superpower is trying to win over. The Afghan government installed by the Americans was kleptocratic, predatory, and dependent on foreign troops for its survival. The Yemeni government supported by the Saudis was weak, divided, and widely despised. The South Vietnamese government was a rotating cast of generals and politicians who commanded no popular loyalty. In every case, the superpower's local ally was the weakest link, a facade of legitimacy that crumbled the moment foreign support was withdrawn. The guerrilla, by contrast, needs no such facade. His legitimacy comes from resistance itself, from the simple fact that he is fighting the foreigner, and that fact is understood by every villager without need for explanation. The cultural arrogance is perhaps the most persistent and least acknowledged factor. Superpowers enter small wars convinced that their way of life is superior, that their political system is desirable, that the local population will welcome them as liberators. They are shocked when the population does not welcome them, when the schools they build are burned, when the roads they pave are mined, when the elections they organize produce leaders who oppose their presence. They cannot comprehend that their version of freedom, their model of governance, their vision of progress, might be irrelevant or offensive to people with their own traditions, their own hierarchies, their own definitions of dignity. The American failure in Vietnam was partly a failure to understand Vietnamese nationalism, to recognize that Ho Chi Minh was a hero to his people regardless of his communist ideology, that the Vietnamese had been fighting foreign invaders for 1,000 years and would continue fighting until the last one left. The American failure in Afghanistan was partly a failure to understand Afghan tribalism, to recognize that loyalty to tribe and clan trumped loyalty to any centralized state, that the concept of a national identity imposed from Kabul was foreign to a people whose primary allegiance was local and whose primary enemy was any outsider who tried to change that. The Saudi failure in Yemen was partly a failure to understand Yemeni resilience, to recognize that a people who had resisted the Ottomans, the British, and the Egyptians would not bow to a neighbor they had long considered arrogant and illegitimate. The superpower sees the small war as a projection of its own values. The guerrilla sees it as a defense of his own identity. And identity, in the end, is the stronger force. The aftermath of small wars is as instructive as the wars themselves. Vietnam fell to the communists in 1975, and the domino theory that had justified the war proved false. Vietnam did not export revolution. It did not threaten American interests. It became within a generation, a trading partner, a tourist destination, a country whose young people wear American brands and dream of Silicon Valley careers. The war had been pointless. The deaths had been wasted. The trauma had been absorbed into American culture as a wound that still bleeds in politics and cinema and the haunted eyes of aging veterans. Afghanistan fell to the Taliban in 2021, and the nation-building project that had consumed 20 years and trillions of dollars collapsed in 11 days. The girls' schools were closed. The human rights activists were hunted. The interpreters, who had trusted American promises, were left behind to face the vengeance of the enemy. The war had been pointless. The sacrifices had been betrayed. The withdrawal had been a humiliation that broadcast American weakness to every adversary watching. Yemen's war continues, but its outcome is already clear. The Houthis will control the north. The Saudis will have spent their treasure for nothing. The humanitarian catastrophe will scar a generation. And the pattern will repeat, because the superpowers that lose small wars do not learn from them. They forget them, bury them in archives and memorials, and move on to the next conflict with the same assumptions, the same arrogance, the same blindness to the forces that defeated them. The question that should haunt every strategist in Washington, Riyadh, Moscow, and Beijing is whether this pattern can be broken. Is there a way for a great power to fight a small war and win? History offers few examples. The British in Malaya, perhaps, where a combination of political reform, ethnic division among the guerrillas, and a relatively limited strategic objective, allowed a successful counterinsurgency. But Malaya was an exception that proves the rule. It required a colonial power willing to grant independence, a guerrilla movement isolated from external support, and a population that could be divided and pacified. These conditions rarely exist. More often, the great power demands too much, the guerrilla is too connected, and the population is too unified in its resistance. The small war, in its classic form, is unwinnable by conventional means because it is not a conventional war. It is a political struggle disguised as a military one, a test of wills rather than a test of arms, and the will of the guerrilla, fighting for his home against a foreigner who will eventually leave, is always stronger than the will of the superpower, fighting for abstractions that fade with every casualty report and budget overrun. The implications for the future are sobering. America, despite its humiliations in Vietnam and Afghanistan, remains committed to a global military posture that invites small wars. Its alliances, its bases, its ideological commitments create obligations that can drag it into conflicts where the guerrilla math applies. A war with Iran, whether triggered by a nuclear crisis, a Hormuz closure, or a proxy escalation, would likely follow the same pattern. American air power could destroy Iranian military infrastructure, but it could not pacify a population of 80 million people with a deep tradition of resistance. American special forces could hunt Iranian operatives, but they could not prevent the activation of proxy networks across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. American technology could dominate the battlefield, but it could not win the political struggle for hearts and minds in a region where American credibility has been shattered by decades of failed interventions. China, rising and ambitious, will face the same math if it chooses to project force beyond its borders, whether in the South China Sea, in Africa, or in some future conflict we cannot yet imagine. Russia, already bleeding in Ukraine, is learning the hard way that a superpower's advantages mean little when the enemy refuses to surrender and the cost of victory exceeds the value of the prize. The small war is the great equalizer, the trap that catches every empire that thinks its power is limitless, and the lesson that no empire ever learns until it is too late. And so the motorbikes will keep coming in the early morning. The sandals and the old rifles will keep appearing where satellite imagery says they should not be. The villages will keep sheltering the fighters and lying to the patrols and planting the bombs that turn billion-dollar vehicles into burning wrecks. The superpowers will keep sending their young men and women to distant valleys and mountain passes, will keep writing checks that drain their treasuries, will keep promising victory while the calendar pages flip and the polls turn and the will to continue crumbles. And one day, the helicopters will lift off from another embassy rooftop, the flags will be lowered, the allies will be abandoned, and the guerrillas will walk into the cities that the superpower could not hold. It has happened before. It is happening now. It will happen again. Because the small war is not an anomaly. It is the natural law of empire, the price of overreach. The proof that power without understanding is not power at all, but merely force, and force, applied blindly and endlessly against the people who will not yield, becomes not a weapon but a rope with which the great power hangs itself. The guerrilla knows this. He has always known it, and he will be there on his motorbike, in his sandals, with his grandfather's rifle, when the last foreign soldier turns toward the sea and the empire, exhausted and bewildered, begins the long retreat home.